He offered coins without questions. She offered only silence. She would arrive just as the morning sun crested the jagged peaks of Wren Valley, a ghost gliding out of the mist. She never knocked. The cabin door was always unlocked. He'd leave it that way for her, a silent agreement between two people who didn't trade in words. She would take the broom from its hook, the bucket from the porch, and begin her work. Scrubbing floors raw, hauling water from the deep well, mending the tears in his world with quiet, methodical purpose. She moved like a phantom, leaving behind nothing but cleanliness and the faint, clean scent of lye soap. And by dusk, just as the last rays of light bled from the sky, she would vanish. Back into the hills she came from, without a word, without a glance back. Eli Mercer only noticed her because of the silence. It was a loud silence, a heavy one. It clung to her like a second skin. He was a man who knew silence well. It had been his only companion for the 5 years since his wife, Sarah, had been taken from him, leaving a hole in his life so vast it had swallowed every word he owned. But this woman's silence was different. It wasn't empty. It was full of things unsaid, of stories locked away behind teeth that never parted. The first time he hired her, he'd found her standing at the edge of his property, just staring at his cabin. She was small, younger than he first thought, maybe late 20s. Her clothes were a patchwork of repairs, and her boots looked like they'd seen 1,000 miles of bad road. He'd offered her a day's work for a silver coin. She'd simply nodded. She worked harder than any man he'd ever hired. She scraped dried blood from the floorboards where he'd put down a rabid fox weeks ago, never flinching. She stacked a cord of wood without breaking her rhythm. She never stopped, never rested, never asked for a thing. When evening came, he placed the coin on the table. He expected her to check it, maybe even try to haggle. She didn't. She just wiped her hands on her worn apron, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and walked away. No horse, no wagon, no one waiting for her down the road. She just melted back into the trees. Eli told himself he wouldn't think about her. He was a surveyor, a man of maps and lines, not of people and their messy, complicated lives. But a week later, she was back. Same time, same silence, same relentless work. And when she left, the coin he'd placed on the table for her was still there, untouched. This became their ritual. Every week, she would appear, clean his home from top to bottom, and leave the payment behind. He started watching her more closely. There was a grace to her movements, something that didn't belong to a life of hard labor. It was the way she held her spine straight, even when hauling buckets that should have bent her in two. It was the way her eyes, dark and deep, would sometimes drift to the horizon, as if looking for something she knew she'd never find. He learned her name from a small cloth satchel she once left by the door. Stitched into the fabric in neat, careful letters were the words, Myra Jansen. No last name, just that. It was the 6th week, on a cold, unforgiving evening, that his curiosity finally got the better of him. He watched her figure shrink into the dense wall of pines at the edge of his clearing. There was no road there, no trail he'd ever seen, just an impenetrable tangle of undergrowth and shadow. He told himself he was just going to check the north fence line. A lie. He saddled his horse, an old gray mare named Dust, and urged her forward, keeping a respectful distance. He thought maybe Myra would look back, but she never did. She never, ever looked back. The path she took was barely a path at all, a thin, winding scar through the wilderness that no horse could follow. He dismounted, tying Dust to a low-hanging branch, and continued on foot. The air grew colder, the trees thicker, blocking out the last of the dying light. He pushed through thorny branches that tore at his coat, his boots sinking into the damp, cold earth. He was about to turn back, convinced he'd lost her, when he smelled it. The faint, desperate scent of wood smoke. He crested a small ridge, and his heart stopped. It wasn't a cabin. It wasn't even a proper shack. It was a hovel, a crude lean-to burrowed into the hillside beneath the collapsed remains of an old miner's shed. The roof was a disaster of patched tarps and rusted tin, and smoke curled from a crooked chimney like a final, dying breath. And then he saw them. Children. Not one or two. 5 of them. The oldest looked to be no more than 10, a boy with old eyes and a man's posture. The youngest was a toddler, still unsteady on her feet, wandering through the frozen mud in a thin, ragged dress. Myra was inside, her silhouette flickering behind a torn blanket that served as a curtain. She was stirring a dented pot over a pitiful fire. Eli stood frozen on that ridge, a statue carved from shock and disbelief. This wasn't just poverty. This was a secret, a desperate, hidden world clinging to life by a thread. He watched as the toddler stumbled and fell, a sharp cry piercing the quiet evening. In an instant, Myra was there, rushing out barefoot onto the frozen ground. She swept the little girl into her arms, murmuring soft words he couldn't hear, kissing a scraped knee. The other children moved with a silent, practiced efficiency that broke his heart. A young girl, maybe 9, was mending a blanket with a bone needle. 2 smaller boys were gathering twigs, their faces smudged with soot. They worked without complaint, without a single wasted motion. This wasn't a family living. This was a unit surviving. A cold, hard knot formed in Eli's gut. He finally understood the untouched coins. To a woman fighting a war like this, a single silver coin was an insult. It was a drop of water in a burning desert. He backed away slowly, silently, his presence a violation of their fragile world. He rode home in the dark, the image of those 5 small faces burned into his mind. The next day, he didn't wait for her to come. He loaded a canvas sack with flour, smoked ham, a jar of honey, and a block of hard cheese. He rode the winding trail back to the hovel and nailed the sack to the flimsy doorframe. He didn't wait for thanks. He didn't want it. He just left. A week passed. The sack was gone. The following week, she appeared at his cabin again. Same time, same silence. She cleaned everything, her movements as fluid and efficient as ever. She left the coin he'd offered on the table. But this time, just before she stepped out the door, she paused. For a fraction of a second, her shoulders tensed. She looked back at him, her eyes meeting his for the very first time. There was no gratitude in her gaze, no anger, just a deep, bottomless well of something he couldn't name. Then she was gone. He kept leaving things, biscuits wrapped in cloth, a warm wool blanket, a small leather pouch of dried apples. She never took more than one thing at a time. Then one day, she left a note on his porch, weighed down by a smooth riverstone. Please stop. 2 words. Her handwriting was as neat and careful as the stitching on her satchel. It wasn't an angry note. It was quiet. It was final. So he stopped. Or he tried to. But then the boy came. The oldest one, 10, maybe 11 years old. He had his mother's eyes, filled with a gravity no child should possess. He knocked on the door with a hesitant, practiced rhythm, as if he'd rehearsed the moment 100 times. Eli opened the door. The boy stood there, clutching a small woven basket. Inside were 6 speckled eggs. For the help, the boy said, his voice quiet but steady. It's all we have to give. Ma says thank you. He pushed the basket into Eli's hands, turned, and walked away before Eli could find a single word to say. That night, the first snow of the season began to fall. Not a gentle dusting, but a thick, heavy blizzard that promised to bury the world. Eli sat by his fire, the basket of eggs on his table, a silent testament to a pride he couldn't possibly comprehend. He stared at the door, thinking of that pathetic roof of tarps and tin. Myra didn't come the next day, nor the day after. On the 3rd morning, the snow was waist-deep, and a gnawing dread was chewing through Eli's gut. He couldn't sit still any longer. He saddled Dust, his heart pounding a heavy rhythm against his ribs, and rode out into the white, silent world. The journey was treacherous. The trail was gone, buried under a mountain of snow. He relied on memory alone, his horse struggling with every step. When he finally reached the ridge overlooking the hovel, his blood ran cold. The roof had collapsed, just a corner of it, but it was enough. It had given way under the weight of the snow, leaving a gaping hole open to the blizzard. No smoke rose from the chimney, no light flickered from within. There was only a terrifying, deathly stillness. "Myra!" he yelled, his voice swallowed by the howling wind. No answer. He slid off dust and plunged through the deep snow, his mind racing with horrific images. He tore away the blanket serving as a door and stepped inside. The children were huddled together under a pile of thin quilts, their eyes wide and dark in the dim light. They were shivering, their faces pale with cold and fear, but they were alive. Myra was not among them. "Where is your mother?" Eli asked, his voice gentle. The oldest boy, Nathan, stood up, trying to shield his siblings. "Mama went for help," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Yesterday, she said she'd be back by nightfall." She hadn't come back. Eli didn't hesitate. He knew the only direction she could have gone was toward the main trail, toward the distant hope of Wren Valley. He turned his horse and rode like a man possessed, scanning the endless white landscape for any sign of life. The wind tore at his face, ice stinging his eyes. It was near dusk, the light failing fast when he finally found her. She was curled beneath a fallen pine tree, a small, still heap in the snow. Her leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and one arm was bent beneath her, clearly broken. Her lips were blue and cracked, and a smear of frozen blood stained her sleeve. She was conscious, but barely. Her eyes fluttered open as he knelt beside her. "I was coming back," she murmured, her voice a fragile wisp of sound. "The children—" "They're safe," Eli said, his own voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. He lifted her as gently as he could, her body weighing almost nothing in his arms, and carried her back to his horse. Getting her and the children back to his cabin was an ordeal. He loaded them all into his cart, bundling them in every blanket he owned. They were silent, stiff with fear and cold, their wide eyes following his every move. When he carried Myra inside and laid her on his own bed, the one his wife Sarah had slept in, a profound and terrifying shift occurred. The silence in his home was broken, not by noise, but by the presence of life, of need, of a family that was not his. It was the first time Eli Mercer had let anyone else inside the walls he had built around his heart in 5 years. He knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, it wouldn't be the last. The storm had trapped them, all of them. For 3 days, the snow fell without end, sealing the cabin off from the rest of the world. Eli's quiet, ordered life was shattered into a million pieces. His small home, once a sanctuary of solitude, was now filled with the soft sounds of breathing, the rustle of blankets, and the silent, watchful eyes of 5 children. He rose before dawn each morning, the cold floorboards creaking under his weight. He stoked the fire, his first thought not for himself, but for the small bodies huddled near the hearth. He made oats for breakfast, portioning it out carefully, and tried not to stare at the woman lying in his bed. Myra drifted in and out of consciousness, her brow slick with fever. He had done his best to set her broken arm, splinting it with a piece of kindling and wrapping it with strips torn from one of his own shirts. Her leg was badly sprained, swollen and bruised. He knew she was in immense pain, but she never made a sound. The children were a mystery. They moved around him like ghosts, their grief and fear wrapped in a thick blanket of silence. Nathan, the oldest at 11, was already shouldering the weight of a man. He rarely left his mother's side, his hand often resting on her forehead as if he could will the fever away. He spoke only when necessary, his voice low and serious. Lisa, who was 9, had sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She organized the younger ones, ensuring their quilts were tucked in tight, that the scarce bread was divided into perfectly equal shares. She had a way of looking at Eli, not with fear, but with a kind of cautious assessment, as if weighing his worth. Ben, at 7, was a bundle of nervous energy. He kept a slingshot tucked in his waistband at all times, a small, defiant protector. Tommy was 5, skittish and shy, and would hide behind his older sister whenever Eli entered the room. And then there was Clara, the baby, only 3. She spent most of her time asleep, one thumb tucked firmly in her mouth. They took up a space in his home that was more than just physical. The air felt different, warmer, thicker, alive, and it terrified him. What unnerved him most was their gratitude. It wasn't spoken. It was in the way Nathan would give a stiff, formal nod when Eli handed him a plate of food. It was in the way Lisa, without being asked, began folding his laundry after it dried by the fire. It was in the way little Clara, in a moment of sleepy confusion, held up her ragged, one-armed doll, as if offering it in trade for a cup of warm broth. These were children who had been taught that kindness always came with a price. They were trying to pay their debt. He never asked about their father. He didn't have to. The answer was in the haunted look in Myra's eyes when she'd stir from her fevered sleep, her first instinct always to count her children. It was in the way all 5 of them would flinch whenever a log shifted in the fire, or when his boots scraped too loudly on the floor. It was in the faint, faded bruises he saw on Myra's ribs when he changed her bandage. This was not a family that had been abandoned. This was a family that had escaped. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Myra sat up on her own, her movements slow and pained. Her lips were chapped, but her voice, when she finally spoke to him, was shockingly clear and even. "I told you not to follow me," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. Eli was kneeling by the bed, checking the splint on her arm. He didn't look up. "You told me a lot of things without ever saying a word." She winced as he gently adjusted the wrapping. "You should have left us there." "I did," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Once." She didn't reply. She just closed her eyes and leaned her head back against the pillow, the silence between them filled with the crackle of the fire and 1,000 unspoken questions. Later that night, he found Nathan sitting on the porch, wrapped in one of Eli's oversized coats, staring out at the moonlit, snow-covered world. The storm had finally passed. Eli sat down on the top step beside him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. "She doesn't sleep much," the boy said finally, his gaze fixed on the distant trees. "Even when she's well, she gets up in the night. She checks our boots, our coats, makes sure the packs are ready." He paused, his small shoulders slumping. "She's always thinking we're going to have to run again." Eli turned to look at the boy, surprised by the weary resignation in his voice. "Did you ever ask her why?" Nathan shook his head, a bitter, knowing look on his young face. "Didn't have to." Something shifted in that moment. An unspoken understanding passed between the man who had lost everything and the boy who was trying to hold his world together. The next day, Eli repaired the old sled he kept in the barn. He hitched it to his mule and made the long, arduous journey into Wren Valley. The town was buzzing with gossip, but Eli ignored the stares and whispers. He told the shopkeeper he'd taken in a distant cousin and her family, their home lost to the storm. He bought 2 sacks of flour, a side of bacon, and a sack of potatoes, leaving before the questions could start. When he returned, Myra was sitting by the fire, her dark hair clean and damp, little Clara asleep in her lap. She watched him haul the supplies inside, her expression unreadable. "You are not obligated to do this, Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Neither are you, Mrs. Jansen," he replied, meeting her gaze. And somehow, that settled it. There were no grand declarations, no tearful promises. It was a quiet, unceremonious surrender. Myra stopped leaving her coin on the table. The children slowly began to unpack the few meager belongings they owned. Ben claimed a spot in the loft. Lisa took over the meal planning. Nathan started helping Eli with the morning chores, and Myra, without a word, began mending the seams of Eli's worn-out shirts. Eli Mercer, the man who had locked his heart in a cold, dark room, found himself looking forward to the sound of small footsteps on his floorboards in the morning. He was starting to feel the warmth of the fire again. But peace is a fragile thing in a place like Wren Valley. It never holds for long. And out there, somewhere beyond the snow-covered hills, a shadow was stirring. A shadow that owned her name, and believed it owned her too. It had been nearly 2 weeks since the storm. A fragile sense of normalcy had begun to settle over the cabin. The snow was melting, and the first hints of a reluctant spring were appearing in the muddy patches of ground. Then the first visitor came. She was an older woman, her face pinched and sour, her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her eyes into narrow slits. She rode up to the cabin at midday on a bony nag, her gaze sweeping over the property with open disapproval. She didn't even look at Eli as she reined in her horse. "I'm looking for Myra Jansen," she demanded, her voice as sharp as broken glass. Eli stood on the porch, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't move. "Who's asking?" The woman's lips thinned into a bloodless line. "I'm her husband's cousin. That girl's a thief. Ran off with his children and a good deal of his money. The man's been beside himself with worry." Eli let the silence stretch, his expression unchanging. He knew a lie when he heard one. He could smell it. "You hiding her in there?" the woman pressed, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Ma'am," Eli said, his voice low and cold as a river stone. "If I was, I certainly wouldn't be telling you." She stared at him for a long moment, then spun her horse around in a huff and rode off, kicking up a spray of mud. Eli watched until she was completely gone. That night, he told Myra about the visitor. She didn't cry or panic. Her face became a mask of stone. She just gathered her children close and whispered to them in a language Eli didn't understand, her voice a low, urgent murmur. The next day, without a word, Eli built a hidden latch on the trap door to the small root cellar in the pantry, just in case. For a while, things were quiet again. The sun grew warmer. Myra's arm healed, though she still favored it. She started a small garden behind the cabin, her hands, once used to scrubbing floors, now gently coaxing life from the soil. The children began to thaw. He heard them laugh for the first time, a sound so unexpected it made Myra's head whip around in surprise. Little Clara even started calling him Papa by accident, a slip of the tongue that made Myra freeze, her face flooding with a complicated mix of emotions. Eli just smiled and gently ruffled the girl's hair. But beneath the surface of this newfound peace, Eli felt a storm gathering. He knew the scent of trouble. He'd lived with it his whole life. It came on a Tuesday. He was out with Nathan and Ben, repairing a section of the western fence, when they saw the rider. He was moving slowly, deliberately, on a powerful black horse. He wore a dark coat and sat tall in the saddle, a man who didn't expect trouble because he was the one who usually brought it. "Boys," Eli said, his voice quiet but firm. "Go back to the cabin, now." They didn't argue, they ran. Eli stepped out onto the trail, positioning himself in the rider's path. The man reined in his horse, his eyes cold and assessing. "You Mercer?" he asked. His voice was calm, smooth as oil. "I am. I'm looking for a woman, Myra Jansen." "What for?" Eli asked, his hand drifting instinctively closer to the axe handle leaning against the fence post. The man's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "She's mine. Took my children. Took my name. She seems to think she can just disappear." Eli felt an icy chill crawl up his spine. "She's not yours." The man dismounted slowly, every movement unhurried and confident. He was taller than Eli, broader in the shoulders. "Oh, she will be." He took a step closer, his eyes glinting with a cruel amusement. "Let me give you a piece of friendly advice, Mercer. Myra, she has a talent. She was always good at making men think they were saving her." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You're not the first, you won't be the last, you'll see." Without another word, he turned, swung himself back onto his horse, and rode away, leaving Eli standing there with a heart full of cold dread. That night, Eli didn't take his boots off when he went to bed. He kept a lantern burning low on the table. Sometime in the dead of night, he heard a floorboard creak. He saw Myra's silhouette pause in the hallway, just outside his door. She had heard every word. The wind shifted the next morning. The air tasted different. It tasted of fear. And Eli Mercer, the man who had sworn he would never again open his home or his heart, found himself checking the locks on the windows, counting the shells for his shotgun, and measuring the distance between his cabin and the unforgiving tree line. Something was coming. He just didn't know when. The dog appeared a few days later. Nathan found him on the northern ridge, a half-starved mutt with ribs showing like the teeth of a saw and wary, intelligent eyes. He trailed the boy home, keeping a cautious distance. When Eli saw the dog, he didn't hesitate. "We'll call him Scout," he said. Scout proved his worth immediately. He was quiet, alert, and smart enough to know the difference between a squirrel and a threat. He rarely left the porch, his gaze constantly fixed on the trail leading to the cabin. Lisa took to brushing his matted coat. Ben snuck him scraps from the table, and he became a silent, furry guardian for the family. Myra seemed to relax, just a little, in the dog's presence. It was as if some tightly coiled spring inside her had finally unwound a turn. She was changing. Not into someone else, but more into herself. Her spine seemed straighter, her shoulders less hunched. He caught her humming once while folding laundry, a soft, melodic sound that was nearly lost in the crackle of the fire. She still didn't speak much, but when she did, her words had weight. "The eastern fence is weak," she said one morning, her eyes on the chicken coop. "A fox will get in." Eli looked at her, surprised. "I thought you didn't care for the animals." She met his gaze, a flicker of something almost like a smile in her eyes. "I care about breakfast." But as the children thrived, Myra grew quieter in a different way. It wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of calculation. He saw her studying the old maps he kept in a drawer. He saw the way her eyes would linger on the western hills, measuring distance. She was planning. She was preparing to run again. One night, he heard her crying. It wasn't a loud, desperate sound. It was a quiet, muffled grief, the kind that comes from a place so deep and broken it has no voice. He didn't go to her. He just sat on the floor outside her door, his back against the wall, Scout's head resting on his knee. He sat there all night. The next morning he found her by the creek. She was kneeling on the damp earth, staring into the rushing water. "I thought about leaving," she said without looking at him. "Last night. Taking them and just walking west until we disappeared." Eli kept his eyes on the water. "Why didn't you?" She took a long, slow breath. "Because I think you'd follow." "I would," he said, his voice rough. She finally turned to look at him, her eyes searching his. "I'm tired of running, Eli." The way she said his name, for the first time, sent a jolt through him. "That man," she continued, her voice dropping, "his name is Roland Jansen. He is my husband by law, but not by choice. He wasn't always a monster. He was just proud, and his pride soured, like milk left in the sun." Her fingers dug into the fabric of her skirt. He didn't want a wife. He wanted a possession. He wanted obedience. I gave it to him. Then I gave him children, and something in him broke. He started leaving for days at a time, coming back with a darkness in his eyes and the smell of whiskey on his breath. I never asked where he went. I only asked that he leave the children alone. She looked up, her eyes hard as flint. He didn't. Eli's jaw tightened until it ached. "I took them one night when he was gone," she said. "I left everything behind. I thought we could disappear, but men like Roland, they don't let go of what they believe they own." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "He wasn't just cruel, Eli. He was into something bad, something dangerous. Men would come to the house late at night. Whispers, deals made in the dark. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was staining us, staining the children. This was a new piece of the puzzle, a darker, more terrifying piece. It wasn't just about a brutal husband. It was about something more. He's not just looking for you, Eli realized, the cold dread returning. He's looking for something else. Myra nodded slowly. The night I left, I found a leather satchel hidden under a floorboard. It was full of money, more money than I've ever seen, and papers, maps. She shuddered. I took it. I thought it would be leverage, a way to keep him away from us, but I think I just made myself a target. The silence that followed was heavy with this new, terrible truth. They weren't just hiding from a man. They were hiding from his sins. You're not his anymore, Myra, Eli said, his voice fierce. And his sins are not yours. I know, she whispered, but he's close. I can feel it. She was right. 2 nights later, Eli saw him. A flicker of movement at the edge of the tree line. A lone figure, watching the cabin from the shadows. By the time Eli grabbed his rifle and slipped out the back door, the figure was gone. All that was left was a single crushed cigarette butt and a fresh footprint in the mud. Roland was here. He was scouting them, waiting. Eli didn't tell her. He didn't want to add to her fear. Instead, he prepared. He reinforced the shutters, oiled the hinges on the doors, and taught Nathan how to use smoke to send a signal. He told the children they were playing a game. But Myra knew. He saw it in her eyes. She picked up his hunting rifle, checked the chamber, and sighted down the barrel. I won't run again, Eli, she said, her voice steady. You won't have to, he replied. The next morning, Roland came. He wasn't alone. 2 other men were with him, hard-faced and armed. They stopped their horses 100 yards from the cabin, a clear line of challenge. Eli stepped onto the porch, his shotgun held loosely in his hands. Myra stood just inside the doorway, a silent shadow at his back. Myra, Roland called out, his voice slick with false charm. You look well. I've come to take you and the children home. This is our home, she called back, her voice ringing out with a strength that surprised even Eli. Roland's smile vanished. Don't make this difficult. You know what I'm looking for. Give it to me, and I'll let you and your new friend here live in peace. You don't know the meaning of the word, Eli said, stepping forward. Roland's eyes narrowed into slits of cold fury. You're a dead man, Mercer. His hand moved toward the pistol on his hip, but before he could draw, Myra stepped out onto the porch, the hunting rifle held firm against her shoulder. You threatened my children, she said, her voice as cold and clear as ice. You burned our home. You will not touch them again. Myra, don't be a fool, Roland snarled. She fired. The shot wasn't meant to hit him. It was a warning. It ripped through the air with a deafening crack, splintering the trunk of a pine tree just inches from Roland's head. One of his men, the younger one, yelped in fear and spurred his horse back into the trees. The other hesitated, then cursed and followed him. Roland stood alone, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. You wouldn't dare, he hissed. Try me, she said. She lowered the rifle slightly. Go, now, and never come back. For a long moment, he just stared at her, the hatred in his eyes warring with a newfound fear. Something in her stance, in the finality of her voice, finally broke him. He spat on the ground, turned his horse, and galloped away into the forest. The silence he left behind was profound. You weren't supposed to come out, Eli said, his heart still hammering in his chest. I know, she replied. She turned to look at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Thank you, Eli. And for the first time since she had walked into his life, she reached out and took his hand. It wasn't a gesture of desperation or fear. It was a choice, a beginning. Inside, the children emerged from their hiding places. Nathan, his face pale but determined, still clutching the small pistol Eli had given him. Lisa, holding Clara's hand tightly. Ben, staring out the window with the wide eyes of a boy who had just seen the world change forever. Myra went to them, knelt down, and pulled them into a fierce embrace. In that moment, Eli Mercer knew one simple, undeniable truth. This wasn't his cabin anymore, it was their home. But as the forest swallowed the last sounds of Roland's retreat, a new, colder fear settled in Eli's heart. Roland hadn't gotten what he came for. Men like him didn't just give up. This wasn't over, it was just the end of the beginning. The chickens were the first to go. One morning, Eli went out to the coop and found it empty. The door was torn from its hinges, and the ground was littered with nothing but a few scattered feathers. No blood, no sign of a struggle. It was clean. It was deliberate. It was a message. Roland was toying with them. He wasn't going to storm the cabin again. He was going to bleed them out, bit by bit. A war of 1,000 small cuts. Myra saw the empty coop, and her face hardened. She didn't speak. She just gathered Nathan and Lisa and began reinforcing the fence with a grim determination. The laughter that had begun to blossom in the cabin withered and died. The children's eyes became watchful again. Fear, cold and insidious, began to seep back under the door. A few days later, the well was poisoned. Scout refused to drink from it, growling low in his throat. Eli lowered a bucket and pulled it up. The water smelled faintly of chemicals, a sickly, unnatural scent. They were forced to haul water from the creek, a long and arduous task that left them vulnerable and exposed. The psychological war had begun. Roland was a phantom, a ghost in the trees. He would leave small, unnerving tokens of his presence. A child's doll, one that had belonged to Clara, left hanging by a noose from a tree branch. The handle of Eli's favorite axe split neatly in two and left on the porch steps. A strip of Myra's old apron, the one she'd worn when she first arrived, tied in a neat bow and nailed to the barn door. Below it, carved deep into the wood, were 3 words: "She is mine." Eli felt a rage building inside him, a cold, quiet fury that was more dangerous than any outburst. He was a man of peace, but he had his limits. Roland had just crossed them all. He rode into Wren Valley, his face a grim mask. The whispers followed him everywhere. The story had twisted and grown. Now he was the man harboring a criminal, a thief, an adulteress. He ignored them. He bought supplies, but he also bought something else. Every box of shotgun shells the general store had in stock. When he returned, he found Myra teaching Nathan how to shoot the rifle. Not with fear, but with a calm, steady focus. "He won't stop, will he?" Eli asked, his voice low. "No," she said, not taking her eyes off the boy. "Not until he gets what he wants, or until one of us is dead." That night, a letter appeared, pinned to the front door with a hunting knife. The parchment was expensive, the handwriting elegant. "You have made your choice. She has made hers. The law is on my side, Mercer, but I am a patient man. I will come for what is mine when you least expect it." It wasn't signed with a name. It was signed with a single, bloody thumbprint. "He's bluffing," Myra said, her voice tight. "He won't involve the law. It would bring too many questions he can't answer." "He doesn't need lawmen," Eli said grimly. "He'll bring his own kind of law." The attack came 3 nights later, under the cold, unforgiving light of a full moon. Scout's frantic barking was their only warning. Eli grabbed his shotgun and rushed to the window. Lanterns were bobbing in the darkness, moving through the trees surrounding the cabin. There were at least 5 of them, maybe more. "Myra! The cellar!" Eli yelled. Their plan had been simple: delay and escape. Eli would hold them off while Myra and the children slipped out through the hidden root cellar and into the tunnel they had dug, which led out into a dense thicket 100 yards away. But Myra didn't move toward the cellar. She grabbed the rifle. "No," she said, her voice filled with a terrible finality. "No more running!" The first shot shattered a window, spraying glass across the floor. The children screamed. "Get them down!" Myra commanded Nathan, who immediately herded his younger siblings under the heavy oak table. "This is madness, Myra!" Eli shouted over the sound of another gunshot. We can't fight them all! We have to, she said, her face pale but resolute. A voice called out from the darkness, Roland's voice, dripping with arrogant confidence. Give me the satchel, Myra. Give me the map and I'll let you all walk away. The map? Eli looked at her, confused. What map? It doesn't matter, she cried, firing the rifle through the broken window. A man yelped in pain. They were trapped. The cabin was surrounded. Gunshots echoed in the night, tearing through the thin wooden walls. Eli fired back, his shotgun bucking against his shoulder, a grim dance of survival under the moonlight. Then, a new sound. The roar of fire. The barn! Nathan yelled from under the table. They've set the barn on fire! Flames leaped into the night sky, casting a hellish orange glow over the entire clearing. They were being flushed out, like animals from a burrow. Smoke began to pour into the cabin. We have to go, Eli coughed, his eyes stinging. The cellar! It's the only way! Myra looked at the fire, at the terrified faces of her children, and her resolve finally broke. She nodded, her face streaked with soot and tears. Go! I'll cover you! Eli didn't argue. He grabbed Lisa and Ben while Nathan grabbed Tommy and Clara. They scrambled toward the pantry, toward the hidden trap door. Eli threw it open, revealing the dark earthen hole of the root cellar. Get in! Go! He urged. The children scurried down the ladder. Eli turned back for Myra. She was standing by the window, firing the rifle one last time to cover their retreat. Myra, come on! A figure burst through the front door. It was Roland. His face was wild, his eyes filled with a crazed light. He wasn't aiming for Myra. He was aiming for the pantry, for the escaping children. No! Myra screamed. She threw herself in front of Roland, using her own body as a shield. He fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. Myra cried out and crumpled to the floor. A blind, white-hot rage erupted in Eli. He raised his shotgun and fired both barrels at point-blank range. Roland was thrown backward, a look of pure shock on his face, before he collapsed in a heap by the door. Eli rushed to Myra's side. She was bleeding, a dark stain spreading across her shoulder. The children, she gasped, her eyes fluttering. Are they safe? They're safe, he said, his voice breaking. He tore a strip from his shirt, pressing it hard against the wound. You're going to be okay. Just hold on. The sound of approaching horses thundered outside. Not Roland's men. This was different. More organized. Lawmen. Someone must have seen the fire. Eli looked at the scene around him. The burning barn, the bullet-riddled cabin, Roland's body lying by the door, and Myra bleeding on his floor. He had saved them, but in the eyes of the law, he was a killer. He had just traded one prison for another. The sheriff, a hard-bitten man named Ames, stood in the middle of Eli's cabin, his face grim. The fire was out, the last of Roland's men had been rounded up, and a doctor was tending to Myra's wound in the other room. The bullet had gone clean through her shoulder. She would live. The children were huddled together on the porch, wrapped in blankets, their faces pale and stunned. So you're telling me, Sheriff Ames said, gesturing to Roland's body, that this man, Roland Jansen, came here tonight to kill you all, and you shot him in self-defense? That's right, Eli said, his voice flat. Ames kicked at a spent shotgun shell on the floor. And this woman, Myra Jansen, his wife, what's her part in all this? She was defending her children, Eli said, his gaze unwavering. The sheriff sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. The story in town is a little different, Mercer. They say you stole this man's wife, that she was a thief. The story in town is wrong. Ames walked over to the table and picked up the letter that was still pinned there with Roland's knife. He read the bloody thumbprint at the bottom. This is a mighty strange letter for a man just looking to get his family back. He looked at Eli, his eyes sharp and assessing. There's more to this story, isn't there? Something you're not telling me. Before Eli could answer, the doctor emerged from the bedroom. She's stable, Sheriff. Lost a lot of blood, but she's strong. She's asking for him. He nodded toward Eli. Eli walked into the bedroom. Myra was lying on the bed, her face as white as the sheets, but her eyes were clear. She reached out a weak hand and grabbed his. "The satchel," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "It's still here, under the loose floorboard by the hearth." "I know," Eli said. "You have to give it to them, Eli," she said, her grip tightening. "The law. It's the only way this ends. The money, the map, it's evidence. It's proof of what Roland was." Eli stared at her. He finally understood. The satchel wasn't just leverage. It was her confession. It was the key to a story far bigger and more dangerous than just a domestic dispute. Roland wasn't just an abusive husband. He was a criminal, caught up in a web of smuggling and theft that stretched across the territory. The map wasn't for treasure. It was a map of smuggling routes, of drop points, of names. Roland hadn't been trying to get his family back. He'd been trying to get the evidence that would send him and his associates to the gallows, and Myra had taken it. "If I give this to them," Eli said slowly, "they'll ask questions. They'll want to know how you got it. They might charge you." "Let them," she said, a flicker of her old fire returning to her eyes. "I am not afraid of the truth anymore. I'd rather be in a jail cell as a free woman than in a home as a slave. I just want my children to be safe, truly safe." Eli stood there, torn. He could hide the satchel. He could let the story die with Roland. They could start over, here, together. But the shadow of the secret would always be there, lurking in the corners. Myra was right. The only way to truly be free was to bring everything into the light, no matter the cost. He walked back out to the main room, knelt by the hearth, and pried up the loose floorboard. He pulled out the heavy leather satchel and placed it on the table in front of Sheriff Ames. "I think you'll find the answers to your questions in here, Sheriff," Eli said. Ames opened the satchel. His eyes widened as he saw the stacks of cash, the bundled papers, the intricately drawn map. He looked up at Eli, a new understanding dawning on his face. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, shaking his head. "This ain't no domestic squabble. This is something else entirely." He looked from the satchel to the closed bedroom door. "That woman in there? She's got more courage than any 10 men I know." He gathered up the satchel. "I'm going to have to take you in for questioning, Mercer. You and Mrs. Jansen, once she's able to travel. We need your testimony." Eli nodded. He had known this was coming. "What about the children?" he asked, his voice tight. Sheriff Ames looked over at the 5 small figures huddled on the porch. He was a hard man, but he wasn't without a heart. "They'll stay here for now. My wife will come up in the morning to look after them. They've been through enough." He paused, his gaze softening for a moment. "You did a good thing here, Mercer. A hard thing, but a good thing." As the sheriff led him out of the cabin and into the gray light of dawn, Eli looked back at his home. It was scarred and broken, but it was still standing, just like the family inside it. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if he would ever see this place again. But for the first time in a very long time, the silence inside him wasn't empty. It was filled with a quiet, defiant hope. The fight was over. But the battle for a new life had just begun. The trial was the talk of the territory. The story that unfolded in the dusty courthouse was more gripping than any dime novel. It was a tale of greed, betrayal, and a powerful smuggling ring known as the Blackwood Gang, with Roland Jansen at its dark heart. The map and ledgers from the satchel were the keys that unlocked the entire conspiracy. Names were named, crimes were exposed, and a dozen powerful men who had hidden behind masks of respectability were brought to justice. Eli and Myra were the star witnesses. Eli's testimony was simple, direct, and unshakable. He told the court what he had seen, what he had done, and why. But it was Myra who captivated the courtroom. She stood before the judge, no longer a silent, fearful woman, but a figure of quiet strength and dignity. She told her story, her voice never wavering. She spoke of the abuse, the fear, and the night she finally decided to run. She told them how she had taken the satchel, not for greed, but as the only weapon she had to protect her children. When the verdict came down, the judge cleared Eli of all charges, ruling his actions a clear case of justifiable homicide in the defense of his home and family. Then he turned to Myra. He praised her courage, her resilience, and her fierce maternal love. He sentenced her to 1 day in custody for the theft of the satchel, a sentence she had already served while awaiting trial. She was free, truly and completely free. When they walked out of the courthouse, the sun was shining. The people who had once whispered about them in the streets now looked at them with a mixture of awe and respect. The children were waiting for them, cared for by the sheriff's kind wife. They ran to Myra, burying their faces in her skirt, their tears ones of relief, not fear. Nathan, his face serious as always, walked straight up to Eli and, for the first time, threw his arms around his waist in a fierce, grateful hug. They returned to the cabin on the hill. It was scarred, but it was whole. With the help of neighbors who were now friends, they rebuilt the barn, patched the bullet holes, and replaced the broken windows. Life settled into a new rhythm, one of peace and healing. The children's laughter became a common sound, echoing through the pines. Lisa's garden flourished. Ben learned to play a whole song on his harmonica. Tommy stopped hiding, and Clara's drawings now featured a big, smiling sun above their cabin. One evening, as the sun set, casting long, golden shadows across the valley, Eli and Myra sat on the porch, watching the children play by the creek. Scout lay at their feet, his head resting on Eli's boot. "I never thought," Myra said, her voice soft, "that I would ever feel safe again." "This is your home now, Myra," Eli said, turning to her. "Our home." She smiled, a real, radiant smile that lit up her whole face. "I know." He had offered her coins, and she had offered him silence. But in the ruins of their broken lives, they had found something far more valuable. They had found a family. They had found a future. They had found a home, built not of wood and stone, but of courage, resilience, and a quiet, unshakable love. And this time, they knew the peace would hold. If you were moved by the story of Eli and Myra and their fight for a family, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of survival and the unbreakable human spirit.